The first burst from the barge's Type 92 heavy machine gun laced the night with orange sparks. Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Lynch hunched lower behind the wheelhouse armor of PT-48, knuckles white on the engine telegraph. The October air over Iron Bottom Sound was hot and wet, thick with exhaust and salt. His boat knifed through the black water at 30 knots, bow bucking, spray sheeting over the deck and soaking the men. Off the port bow, 3 dark shapes crawled westward along the coast of Guadalcanal, Japanese Daihatsu barges. Boxy silhouettes, low to the water, steel-plated sides, just visible each time a wave crested, and moonlight flashed off them. 60 men and ammunition each, Lynch thought. That's another battalion creeping toward Henderson Field. He'd been out here 14 nights, 14 patrols, 0 confirmed kills. Above the engine roar and wind, he heard the hammering reply of PT-48's twin 50 caliber Brownings in the aft turret. Tracers reached out, glowing beads stitching across the water, pinging harmlessly off the barge's vertical armor. Every impact sparked like someone flicking a lighter against a steel plate. "Nothing!" the stern gunner yelled, voice high and tight. "They're bouncing, Skipper! Just bouncing!" Lynch already knew. He'd seen it before. 50 cal that could cut a wooden fishing junk in half, doing little more than scratch paint on a Daihatsu side plate. Behind him, under the narrow bow deck, sat the real gamble. PT-48 still carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes in their tubes, each one over 2,000 pounds of steel and explosive, each with a 466-pound TNT warhead. But the Mark 8s were set to run deep, 10 feet at minimum. The Japanese barges drew maybe 5. Every time you fired, the math stayed the same, a white streak under black hulls, a trail of bubbles, and nothing. That had been the pattern all month. Tonight, Lynch was trying something else. Something the squadron commander hadn't exactly blessed, something the base armorer had laughed at before helping anyway. Under a rough canvas tarp on the foredeck, lashed to a makeshift mount of welded pipe and scavenged angle iron, was the nose of an airplane. Not just any airplane. The chopped-off forward fuselage of a wrecked P-39 Airacobra, stripped of its skin, nose wheel, and wiring, but still cradling its 37mm M4 cannon, the Oldsmobile gun that usually spat shells through a fighter's propeller hub. Now it pointed straight ahead over PT-48's bow like a steel snout, a drum magazine latched to its side, cables running back to a jury-rigged trigger in the cockpit. A P-39 nose on a 77-foot plywood boat. "Range, 400 yards, called Ensign Haskell, crouched by the chart table, binoculars glued to his face. "Closing fast. They're turning in toward the beach." Lynch's heart pounded in his throat. 400 yards, way too far for a torpedo to arm effectively against something that shallow, but close enough for blunt steel and high explosive shells. "Stand by on the 37, Lynch shouted. On the foredeck, Seaman of First Class Eddie Romero kicked the tarp free. The Airacobra nose lay revealed in the moonlight, crudely bolted tripod of pipe, reinforcement beams cut from a wrecked dock, a scrounged aircraft gun sight roughly aligned along its barrel. Sweat gleamed on Eddie's face as he swung the snout toward the lead barge. "Ready!" he yelled over his shoulder, one hand on the breech, the other on the jury-rigged traverse handle. Incoming tracers streaked past. Japanese rounds now, long slow arcs across the waves, greenish-white where they slammed into spray around the PT boat. One line of fire walked its way toward the bow, inch by inch. Lynch risked a glance at his torpedo tubes. 4 perfect weapons for deep-draft destroyers, useless tonight. It all came down to a salvaged airplane gun held to the deck with welds that might not survive the first shot. "Eddie!" Lynch shouted. The lead barge turned its bow toward them, Type 92 chattering on its foredeck. A fresh spray of bullets tore at PT-48's bow wave, a few snapping overhead like angry hornets. "Now!" Lynch roared. Eddie Romero thumbed the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the P-39's 37mm cannon woke up on the nose of a tiny boat. Robert Lynch had grown up in Astoria, Oregon, where the Columbia River met the Pacific. His earliest memories were of gray skies and the smell of fish, of small trawlers rolling in the swell, as his father cursed busted gear and bad weather. On a wheelhouse as big as a closet, he'd learned young what maps didn't show: shifting sandbars, floating logs, the way a half-knot of unexpected current could push a hull against a piling. By the time he was 16, he could thread a 30-foot fishing boat through night fog by the feel of the swell and the sound of breakers. He joined the Navy before Pearl Harbor, quietly, without speeches. Boat school, then the brand-new motor torpedo boat squadrons, full of speed, daring, and glossy brochures showing tiny boats ripping apart cruisers with point-blank torpedo runs. On paper, it was beautiful. 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each capable of shattering a cruiser's hull. A pair of twin 50-caliber mounts, firing 850 rounds per minute each. Extreme speed, 40 knots on a good day, darting in and out of the darkness. Doctrine said, spot the enemy, close to torpedo range, fire and vanish. Map said, deep waters, big ships, decisive nights. Reality off Guadalcanal in October 1942 was different. By then, Henderson Field was hanging on by its fingernails. The Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers racing down the slot by night, had been bringing troops and supplies. American aircraft, Cactus Air Force, began making daylight life hell for those destroyers, so the Japanese adapted. In place of destroyers, they sent barges, steel-sided Daihatsu landing craft, low profile, barely above the waves, powered by diesels that chugged implacably along the coast. Some were armored with scrap plate and sandbags. Many carried Type 92 heavy machine guns and rifle squads. On a chart in the operations shack at Tulagi, those barges were arrows and hash marks, easy to underestimate. Too small to waste fleet assets on, one staff officer said. But to Lynch, out on PT-48 in the humid dark, they were knife wounds bleeding men and ammunition into the island. The problem was cruelly simple. The Mark 8 torpedo had been designed for deep-draft warships. Its depth mechanism had a lower limit, 10 feet, if you believe the manual, which Lynch didn't. Every sailor in the squadron suspected they ran deeper than that in practice. The barges drew 5 feet, maybe 6 loaded. So when PT boats made perfect attack runs, when the bow swung through the target line and the skipper punched the firing plunger, the white streak of a Mark 8's wake would boil under the surface, clean under the Japanese hulls. If the pistol didn't strike metal, it didn't detonate. Maps said the Solomons were island chains and sea lanes. The men of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 learned that, in practice, they were a chessboard of shallow reefs, black coves, and enemy barges that sneered at American torpedoes. In the ready tents and at the mess tables on Tulagi, frustration simmered. 6 boats lost, 17 men dead. Charred planks and twisted aluminum washing ashore. Smoke on the horizon where another PT had tried to press in for a close shot and run into a Type 92's beaten zone instead. Ideas bubbled up, desperate and improvised. An Army liaison officer mentioned they had spare 37mm M3 anti-tank guns lying around, a crude single-shot piece on a wheeled carriage. Crews from several boats pulled wheels, hacked off trails, and lashed the bare guns to wooden planks on their bows. It was something, a big, brutish shell that could, in theory, punch through the barge armor. PT-109, under a tall, skinny lieutenant named Kennedy, got one of those on her foredeck in August. The story spread. The men had spent a day sawing and bolting, and that night, in the swell, they'd tried to hand-aim a land gun from a rolling deck. The damn thing kicked like a mule, one of PT-109's crew had told Lynch. Second shot, she almost tore clear of the lashings. We got a hit or two, but it's like firing a barn door from a canoe. By mid-October, Lynch had watched all this with growing impatience. He wasn't a genius engineer. He was a fisherman's son who knew what happened when you tried to make a dockside plan stand up to a real storm. The Army's M3 worked, sort of. The Mark 8s worked not a T, all against barges. The twin 50s made light shows. Doctrine and maps were losing them the nights. Out on the Tulagi dock one humid afternoon, watching mechanics pull a burnt-out Packard engine from PT-36, Lynch finally said aloud what had been gnawing at him. There's got to be a better way to punch holes in steel. The answer would start with a rumor about a crashed fighter up on Henderson Field and a pile of aircraft wreckage that nobody thought belonged on a boat. Before that rumor reached him, Lynch still had to do things the proper way and watch the cost mount. On October 10th, PT-48 went out on another barge interdiction patrol. The night was thick, overcast, the wind from the southeast. The sea carried a long, lazy swell that rocked the boat side to side as they idled off Cape Esperance. Contacts, 3, maybe 4, bearing 090, Haskell muttered, bent over the TBT, the target-bearing transmitter, binoculars mounted on a rotating pedestal. Lynch nudged the throttles forward. The 3 Packard engines rose in pitch, the hull vibrating as PT-48 accelerated. In the dim red glow of the cockpit lights, his hands moved over familiar switches. They closed to within 1,000 yards. Barrels flashed on the horizon. Type 92s, he knew now, by the rhythm. Not like any Allied gun, a chop, chop, chop that spoke of Japanese fingers on spade grips. "Stand by tubes 1 and 2, Lynch called. "We go in, fire a spread, swing out, just like the manual says." The run-in was a blur of spray and tracers. The 50s chattered, the boat zigzagging to throw off enemy aim. Lynch watched the bearing creep across the dial, timing the moment with practiced instinct. "Fire 1, fire 2. Compressors hissed, mechanisms thumped. 2 Mark 8s streaked out, their wakes glowing faintly in the phosphorescent chop. Lynch held his breath, counting under it. 20 seconds. 30. 40. The barges kept coming, unhurried, boxy silhouettes on the horizon. Somewhere beneath them, in the dark water, 2 perfect torpedoes ran 10 feet deep, unfazed by the absence of metal above them. No flashes, no eruptions, just nothing. The return fire intensified. Tracers walked closer. One punched through the thin armor of the wheelhouse, ricocheted and smashed into the chart table inches from Haskell's hand, showering him with splinters. "Christ," Haskell yelped. "Ducks." And "Hard starboard," Lynch snapped, yanking the wheel. PT-48 swung away. More rounds smacked into the hull, punched holes in the exhaust mufflers, sent jets of spray through the deck. A gunner screamed aft as a splinter tore into his thigh. By the time they disengaged, one engine was coughing, the aft turret shield was pocked with fresh dents, and the only thing they'd accomplished was to burn more fuel and add another name to the squadron sick list. Back at Tulagi, over watery coffee and stale bread, the story repeated itself from other crews. "Ran under 'em. 2 good fish wasted. They just kept on chugging, Skipper, like they were laughing at us." The M3 anti-tank gun experiments weren't much better. Lynch was aboard PT-127 one afternoon, helping its skipper, Lieutenant Red Hansen, adjust the lashings on their bow-mounted 37mm. They'd stripped the wheels, bolted the trail to a massive timber, and wedged it against the bow coaming. "It's ugly, but she'll bark," Red said, patting the gun like a hunting dog. That night, in a moderate swell, Lynch watched from PT-48 as PT-127 made its attack. At 500 yards, the 37mm belched a shell, the flash momentarily blinding. The recoil rocked the little boat, the mount groaning. The shell hit. Lynch saw the white spurt against a barge's side, but the reload was agonizingly slow. 2 men wrestled a shell into the open breech, slammed it shut, and yanked the firing lanyard. The second shot went high, splashing water. By the third, the barge's Type 92 had found its range. Tracers hammered PT-127's bow, smashing the gun shield, cutting down the loader. The boat limped back smoking, the 37mm skewed, its lashings half snapped. Afterward, Red sat on a crate, staring at his bandaged arm. "It's like trying to fight a steel door with a sledgehammer from a rocking raft," he muttered. "We need, I don't know, something that fits the boat, not a land gun we've hammered flat." In the ops shack, Lynch listened as squadron officers argued. "Keep using the torps. Sooner or later they'll commit a destroyer again, and we'll be ready. We're losing hulls and not sinking a damn thing. We need more firepower up front." Command won't authorize structural changes. These boats were designed a certain way. Maps came out. Pointers traced routes. Someone mentioned doctrinal flexibility in the same breath as never modify primary armament without Bureau approval. Lynch thought of his father on the Columbia, spitting tobacco into the bilge and saying, "Son, the sea doesn't give a damn about what's printed on paper." The Pacific didn't either. The Daihatsus were still moving every night. PT Squadron 3 was still coming back empty. And then, 2 days later, a Marine radio tech on leave from Henderson Field walked into the squadron mess and, over a cup of coffee, mentioned a wrecked P-39 rotting at the edge of the runway. "It belly-landed last week. Pilot walked away. They've already stripped the radios and left the rest for the Seabees to push into a pit. Damn thing's got a cannon in the nose as big around as my wrist." Lynch looked up slowly. "A cannon in the nose," he repeated. "Yeah, 37 millimeter or something. Fires through the prop hub. Olds gun, they call it. An airplane nose that spat armor-piercing shells, not a barn-door Army field gun. A weapon built to sit on a vibrating, fast-moving platform." That night, lying on his bunk in the humid dark, listening to the creak of mooring lines, Lynch stared at the slats above him and saw, as clearly as a chart, the shape of a tiny wooden boat with the snout of a fighter plane grafted to its bow. 2 days later, Lynch stood at the edge of Henderson Field, boots sinking into red mud, staring at the corpse of a P-39 Airacobra. The fighter lay tilted, nose dug into a churned furrow, its tail high. The propeller blades were bent back like wilted petals. The canopy was gone, the fuselage skin torn in places where salvage crews had already stripped instruments and radios. But the nose section, that was intact. Under the torn aluminum, nested between bulkheads, sat the heart of it, the M4 37mm cannon built by Oldsmobile, its barrel thrust forward through what had been the propeller hub. Ammo feed and cradle still there. Behind it, racks where the drum magazines had been mounted. A Marine ordnance sergeant squinted at Lynch. "You here for that?" he asked, jerking a thumb at the nose. "Maybe," Lynch said carefully, "if no one's claimed it." The sergeant snorted. "Far as I've heard, the flyboys hate the damn thing. Jams, kicks like hell. They'd rather have more 50s. We're supposed to cut this junk up for scrap once we get around to it. You want it, you sign for it, you haul it." Lynch ran a hand over the cannon's breech. It felt solid, purpose-built, designed to fire high-velocity shells from a platform that twisted and bucked in 3 dimensions. "Where do I sign?" By dusk, PT-48's crew had dragged the entire forward fuselage of the P-39 down to the beach, manhandled it onto a scow, and ferried it back to Tulagi. The sight of a motor torpedo boat towing an Airacobra's nose through the anchorage drew laughter and curses in equal measure. In the makeshift workshop, a tin-roofed shed that smelled of gasoline, hot metal, and mold, Chief Motor Machinist's mate, Pop Dyer, shook his head slowly as the wreckage clanged onto sawbucks. "You're serious about this," he said. Lynch nodded. "We need something that can punch through barge armor, something semi-automatic, built to live, on a fast platform. That gun was designed for a fighter. A PT boat's not that different." Pop spat into a coffee can. "Except for the part where your mount is plywood and paint instead of steel and rivets, and the part where Bureau of Ordnance is going to have kittens if they ever see this." He sighed. "But those barges aren't getting any smaller, are they?" Piece by piece, they stripped the P-39's nose. The skin came off first. Aluminum panels peeled away with wrenches and pry bars, tossed into a scrap pile. Out came the mangled prop hub and the bent shaft. What remained was a steel framework cradle that held the M4 cannon and tied it into the fighter's structure. They unbolted the cradle with curses and crowbars, sweating in the island heat. The cannon itself was a brute, about 6 feet of steel barrel and breech, fed from a 30-round drum that latched onto the side. 200 pounds, maybe a little more, Pop grunted, as they eased it onto a scale improvised from a cargo hook and spring. "Your bow can take it if we spread the load." They tested the action. The M4 was semi-automatic, using recoil to eject and cock for the next shot. Not rapid fire like a Bofors, but far better than single shot. "Where are you going to get ammo?" Haskell asked. "Marine Ordnance has some," Lynch replied. "AP rounds for strafing tanks and pillboxes. We'll convince them this is coastal defense." The mount was the next challenge. They scavenged angle iron from a wrecked pier, pipe sections from a discarded fuel rack, steel plate from damaged PT boats. Under Pop's eye, they welded together a low tripod that bolted directly through PT-48's deck into the bow stringers. "We'll gusset it like a tree stump," Pop muttered, sparks flying from his torch. "Spread the load. Keep the recoil from opening your hull like a sardine can." The M4's cradle bolted atop the tripod. It sat there, snout elevated, looking obscene and somehow elegant. A fighter's gun, looking out over the sea from the nose of a plywood shark. Electrical firing was next. The P-39 had used a solenoid trigger wired to the pilot's control. Pop traced the leads, cursed airplane engineers, and finally jury-rigged a new switch in PT-48's cockpit, wired through a relay. "Flip this safety, thumb that switch, she goes bang. In theory," he said. "You keep that 37 locked straight ahead. You want to change azimuth, you swing the whole boat." They welded a rough shoulder stock and hand grips onto the cradle so a deck gunner could help steady it. For aiming, they stole a reflector sight from the same P-39 wreck, mounted crudely on a steel bar above the breech. When it was done, PT-48's bow looked like some Frankenstein of war, a lean, wooden hull ending in the exposed steel skeleton of an Airacobra's face, its single heavy barrel jutting out over the water. The squadron commander walked down the dock to inspect it, boots thudding on the planks. "What in God's name is that, Lieutenant?" he asked dryly. "Improvised anti-barge gun, sir," Lynch replied, trying to sound matter-of-fact. 37mm aircraft cannon, semi-automatic, AP ammo. Should go through that Daihatsu armor." The commander circled the bow. He prodded a weld with his boot. "This is not authorized by any book I've ever read." "No, sir," Lynch said. "But neither are Japanese barges, running troops every night under our noses." The older man's jaw worked. He looked out at the dark water, where the faint glow of Henderson's fires stained the clouds. "You'll test this contraption yourself, I trust," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "And if it tears your bow off?" "Then you'll have one more data point, sir," Lynch said quietly. The commander stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. "Very well. You will not, under any circumstances, let this interfere with your primary mission of torpedo attack on high-value targets. But if you happen to encounter barges while this thing is aboard, I want a full report." Unofficially, the verdict passed through the squadron was simpler. "They've put a P-39 nose on 48, someone said in the mess. "Lynch is going barge hunting with a fighter on his bow." The nickname spread faster than most regulations. "Devil boat," a machinist's mate muttered admiringly, watching PT-48 ease away from the pier at dusk, the Airacobra snout just visible against the dark water. No one knew that, on the other side of the slot, Japanese sailors were already using a similar term in their own language for the fast, elusive American craft that harassed them at night. They just hadn't yet met one with a fighter's gun grafted to its face. Warrant Officer Tanaka Haruo stood in the stern of his Daihatsu barge, one hand lightly resting on the engine housing, feeling the vibration through his palm. The night air off Cape Esperance smelled of salt and jungle rot. Above, the sky was overcast, the stars smothered. Perfect for running the supply line. Ahead and astern, other barges kept station, dark, squat shapes, barely above the water. Each carried 60 men of the 230th Infantry Regiment, their rifles stacked beside crates of ammunition, rice, and medical supplies. On the bow, a Type 92 heavy machine gun pointed forward, its crew hunched behind a crude shield. Destroyers had once made this run, Tanaka remembered. Sleek, gray warships knifing through the slot at high speed. But American aircraft from Henderson Field had turned daylight into torment for them. Some nights, even in darkness, the sky thundered with bombs. So now the Imperial Navy's coastal transport duty fell to men like him, barge officers with short ships and long routes. He did not complain. War was adaptation. They hugged the coastline, running just outside the surf line, engines throttled low. Their steel side plates, hastily welded on in Rabaul, would turn rifle bullets and shrapnel. The Type 92s would keep away small boats or curious natives. The Americans had their own small boats, of course, the fast motor torpedo craft that the men had come to call Oni no Kobune, devil boats. They were pests, darting in and out of darkness, their wakes glowing white. At first, the tales had been terrifying. Torpedoes that seemed to leap from nowhere, explosions that hurled destroyers into the air. But against barges, those devils had proven mostly toothless. Twice, Tanaka had watched them approach. Long, low silhouettes, engines snarling. Twice, he'd seen white streaks flash under the water, beneath his barge's keels, harmless. And twice, his gunners had sent curtains of fire sweeping across the waves until the Americans sheared off trailing smoke and splinters. "Their big fish are for battleships," one of his men had said. "We are too small, like mosquitoes slipping through a net." Tanaka had nodded. The Americans were brave, no one denied that, but bravery without effect was merely wasteful. Intelligence reports said the enemy had begun bolting army guns onto their little boats. Tanaka was not impressed. A single field piece on a wooden deck did not scare him. Steel plate and discipline did. Tonight's run was critical. The forces on Guadalcanal were hungry, short of ammunition, medicine, even water. His convoy carried boxes of rifle cartridges and machine gun belts, mortar shells, and sacks of rice. They had left Rakata Bay at dusk. Now, near midnight, they were sliding past Cape Esperance, black land rising to port, blacker sea to starboard. The engine tempo was soothing. The helmsman muttered courses off a crumpled chart. The men smoked in silence, cupping their cigarettes. Then one of the forward lookouts stiffened. "Light," he hissed. "Starboard bow, low on the water." Tanaka's head snapped around. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing but ripples of dim reflection. Then he saw it. A faint, momentary flicker, maybe a cigarette, maybe a glint off glass, too low to be land. "Sound action stations," he ordered calmly. The gong clanged. Men scrambled. The Type 92 crew swung their gun toward the darkness, eyes wide. Another lookout shouted now, more urgent. "Wake! There! Moving fast!" A pale scar on the black water coming in from the open sea at an angle growing wider. A devil boat. Tanaka's jaw tightened. "Maintain course," he told the helmsman. "We will not be drawn off into deeper water. Bring the gun to bear. Fire as soon as you see the target's bow." He expected what he had seen before. Twin flashes of machine gun fire, tracers that sparked and died against his steel plates, the trickle of small splinter wounds, nothing worse. The Americans were not fools. They would keep trying their torpedoes. They had no other teeth, he thought. Above the slap of waves on metal, he heard it now. The rising snarl of 3 gasoline engines in unison, the distinctive ripping growl of airborne Packard motors. A dot of darkness resolved itself into a triangular bow wave and a low hull. An American PT boat closing fast. "Ready!" yelled the Type 92 gunner. Tanaka raised his feel. D glasses. The boat's bow climbed slightly as it hit a swell. For an instant its foredeck was outlined against the water. He frowned. Something jutted from the front of the boat, not the usual rounded bow with a pair of machine guns behind. This was a snout, a bare framework of steel at the very tip, and in the center of it, a single, thick barrel. No torpedo launched at shallow craft. No hand-lashed field gun awkwardly perched. A single heavy gun aiming directly at his barge from the nose of the devil boat itself. "New gun," he began, and then the night split open. The first 37mm shell left the barrel of the P-39's cannon with a flat, vicious crack that slapped the air. Eddie Romero felt the whole mount twitch against his shoulder as the M4 recoiled, slid back, and slammed forward again, semi-automatic action clanking. A hot cartridge case spun out, clattered against the deck, and skittered away. At 400 yards, the shell reached the first barge in less than half a second. It struck just above the waterline, dead center in the bow, where the steeply angled armor met the flat hull plate. Steel bulged, tore, and blew inward in a halo of sparks. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a geyser of water and debris erupted from the barge's bow as the blast vented inside the forward compartment. "Hit! Hit!" Haskell shouted, eyes wide behind his binoculars. "Keep it on him!" Lynch yelled, knuckles white on the wheel. PT-48 bucked in the chop, engines howling as Lynch held her steady on the attack run. Tracers from the barge's Type 92 slashed toward them, greenish lines that passed overhead or stitched into the sea just short of the bow. Eddie thumbed the trigger again. Crack. The second shell punched into the barge's gun shield. The front plate ripped loose, the Type 92 flipping backward. Two silhouettes vanished in a wash of sparks and spraying metal. On the barge's deck, men scattered, some leaping for cover, others frozen. The boat's bow had dropped slightly, already taking water through the ragged hole. 300 yards, Haskell called. "Hold course," Lynch said. "Eddie, walk it down the line." The M4 belched again, and again. Semi-automatic rhythm, not machine gun rapid, but in the space of 10 seconds, Eddie sent 5 shells downrange. 2 went into the first barge, each blow deforming steel, blowing jagged rents. 1 shell hit the water short, ricocheted in a shriek of sparks, and slammed into the second barge's side. Another struck just at the waterline of that second hull, punching a fist-sized hole through both sides. Under the muzzle flash, Eddie saw shocked faces, men in Japanese helmets stumbling as their steel box turned suddenly fragile. The third barge's Type 92 finally began firing, its tracers crossing those from the first. Bullets slapped into PT-48's bow, kicked splinters from the deck around Eddie's boots. 1 round smacked into the side of the P-39 cradle, ringing like a bell. "Forward bilge taking water," someone shouted below. "Keep her nose on," Lynch snapped. "This is our only shot." He glanced at the torpedo firing panel. Habit tugged at him, but 10-foot running depth was still 10 feet, and the barges were barely floating. The 37 was all they had. He eased the throttles, shaving a few knots to steady the platform. Enemy tracers inched closer. 1 slashed through the air just above his head, tracing a line through the wheelhouse armor and out the other side with a shower of sparks. 200 yards, Haskell bellowed. Eddie felt the drum magazine start to lighten under his left hand. 20 shells gone? Maybe more. He had no time to count. He trained the nose just ahead of the second barge's bow and fired. The shell hit low, almost at the keel. For an instant, nothing. Then the whole front third of the barge convulsed, a gout of water and metal blasting upward. Men on deck disappeared in a spray of wreckage. The craft's bow sagged, plunging into the sea. The third barge swung wide, trying to angle away toward the beach, perhaps to ground itself. Its gunner traversed frantically, tracing wild lines of fire that stitched the air around PT-48. On that barge's stern, Warrant Officer Tanaka clung to the rail, eyes wide, watching something he had never imagined. A devil boat spitting explosions from its nose like some mechanical oni. "Devil gun," one of his men said, creamed, voice high and broken. "The devil's gun." Tanaka shouted orders, but the sound vanished in the hammering of his own weapon and the rising roar of men shouting and dying. Someone slapped his shoulder, pulling him down as another 37mm shell screamed in. It tore into the gun mount, exploded, and turned the foredeck into a storm of steel and bone. Back on PT-48, a round finally found its mark. A Type 92 burst cut across the bow. 1 bullet slammed into Eddie's upper arm, spinning him sideways with a cry. Another shattered the reflector sight, glass spraying his face. He almost lost his grip on the cradle. The heavy barrel slewed, dipping toward the waves. "I got it!" yelled Seaman Jones, diving forward, grabbing the improvised hand grip. Together, they manhandled the snout back on line, blood dripping on the deck. "Eddie, can you fire?" Lynch shouted. "I can damn well try." Eddie snarled, thumb jamming the trigger. Nothing. He felt the dead slack weight of a jam, action halfway back, something fouled. For a moment the world narrowed to the heavy, stubborn metal in his hands. 30 yards to port, the third barge, still moving, still spitting bullets. "Jam!" Eddie cried. "She's jammed!" Behind him, the twin 50s opened up, both turrets now laying down a conical hail, tracers ricocheting off what remained of the barge's armor, peppering its exposed men, but the heavy plates still held on its main hull. "Mr. Haskell!" Lynch barked. "Get up there!" Haskell didn't even answer. He lunged onto the foredeck, dropped beside the M4, bare hands slapping at the breech. "Clear it, clear it, clear it," he muttered. A twisted shell casing had hung up the extraction. He yanked back the charging handle, fingers slipping on hot steel, and kicked the breech open with the heel of his hand. The casing pinged out, smoking. "Feed! New drum!" he yelled. Jones popped the empty drum free. Another man slid a full one into place, hands soot, haking. The barge's tracer stream crept closer. Bullets chewed into PT-48's bow, blasting chunks of wood into the air. One shot shattered the leg of the 37mm mount. The welded gusset held, but the whole forward deck groaned. "She'll come apart!" someone screamed. "Not yet she won't!" Pop Dyer bellowed from below, as if sheer profanity could hold the hull together. Haskell wrenched the action closed. The cannon slid into battery with a heavy clack. "Up!" he shouted, shoving the nose a fraction to starboard. Eddie, teeth gritted, raised his bleeding arm and curled his thumb over the trigger one more time. He fired. At 100 yards, the shell had no room to miss. It slammed into the third barge's midships plate, punched through, and detonated inside the troop compartment. The side of the barge bulged outward, then burst, a blossom of flame and shrapnel. Men tumbled into the sea, some burning, some silent. The Type 92 fell silent as its crew vanished under a wave of jagged steel. For a moment, the only sound was PT-48's engines and the hiss of steam from shattered barges. "Hard to port," Lynch ordered, finally breaking the enchantment. "Get us out before their shore boys wake up." He swung the wheel, bringing PT-48 around in a tight banking turn around the wreckage. Oil and debris spread over the water. Men thrashed, some waving, some too stunned to move. A few rifle shots cracked from the nearest barge survivors, weak and hopeless. "Hold your fire," Lynch told the 50 gunners quietly. "We've done enough killing tonight." The engines roared as PT-48 sped back into the dark, leaving 3 wrecked barges behind. One sinking bow first, one broken amidships, one just a burning smear on the black water. On the shattered remains of the third barge, Warrant Officer Tanaka lay pinned under twisted metal, chest crushed, unable to move. Above him, his men babbled, voices thin and shrill. "Devil boat," someone whispered. "No, devil gun. They put the devil's gun on their little boat." The term would change, passed from survivor to survivor, embellished and sharpened. By the time it reached Rabaul, the story would be clear. The Americans had boats whose noses spat shells like a fighter plane's, boats that killed barges in a handful of shots. At 03:10, PT-48 limped back into Tulagi's harbor. The bow rode a little lower, planking sprung where enemy fire had chewed into it. The Airacobra mount leaned a few degrees off true, one tripod leg bent. The reflector sight was shattered, and dried blood stained the deck around it. Eddie Romero's arm was bandaged, his sleeve cut away. He sat on a crate, cigarette trembling between his fingers, watching as Pop Dyer and a damage control party inspected the bow. "She held," Pop said gruffly, kicking one of his welds. "Sloppy, ugly, but she held." The squadron commander arrived with a notepad, jaw set. Lynch met him on the dock, still smelling of cordite and sweat. "Report, Lieutenant," the commander said. "Engage 3 Daihatsu barges off Cape Esperance at approximately 2350, Lynch recited. "Torpedo employment not feasible due to shallow enemy draft. Employed improvised 37mm aircraft cannon mounted on bow. Expended." He did the mental tally. 23 rounds. Observed catastrophic damage to all 3 craft. Heavy fires. 2 hulls seen sinking, 3rd adrift and burning as we withdrew. Estimated 75% casualties among embarked troops. The commander scribbled, frowned. And your boat? Minor structural damage to bow. 1 wounded. No fatalities. The older officer looked past Lynch at the torn foredeck and the exposed cannon. And the gun? Jammed once under sustained fire. We cleared it in perhaps 10 seconds. Lynch hesitated. Sir, with refinements to the mount and proper maintenance, I believe this could be an effective standard fit for barge interdiction. The commander's eyes were tired, but there was a glint in them. Of course you do, he said. Write it up. Detailed. I'll forward it, unofficially at first. The last thing we need is some rear area admiral screaming about unauthorized modifications instead of dead Japanese. Word spread faster among the boat crews than any memo. By the next afternoon, men from other PTs were crawling over PT-48's bow, measuring, sketching, asking Pop how he tied the mount into the stringers. Where'd you get the cannon? Henderson, old P-39 carcass near the runway. Hell, we got a crashed P-400 up the hill. Think its gun is still intact? Within weeks, in the scrounge and make-do economy of the Solomons, other Franken boats appeared. Some strapped Army M3s down more securely. Others begged for 20mm Oerlikons from damaged ships. A few, like PT-48, carried salvaged aircraft cannon, P-39, 37mm, even 20mm guns from wrecked Wildcats or P-40s. Bureau of Ordnance notices, when they came, were politely furious. Unit commanders are reminded that unauthorized alteration of primary armament is not permitted. But those notices were mailed from far away, printed on clean paper in clean offices. In the black water off Guadalcanal, what mattered was whether a boat could turn a steel barge into floating scrap before it took a gut full of lead. In after-action reports penned by harried staff officers, phrases crept in. Additional forward-firing armament proved valuable. Modifications by squadron personnel enhanced anti-barge capabilities. Recommend consideration of a purpose-built, deck-mounted automatic cannon for future PT designs. By 1943, new PT boats in the theater began to arrive with 37mm and 40mm guns as factory-planned fittings. The stupid ideas hammered together at Tulagi and Espiritu Santo became checkboxes on official diagrams. On the other side, Japanese intelligence compiled survivor accounts. Enemy small craft now sometimes equipped with heavy automatic cannon forward, one translated report read. These devil boats are especially dangerous to barges. Recommend additional armor and avoidance of open sea approaches where possible. Decades later, in a VFW hall in Oregon with wood-paneled walls and stale beer, retired Lieutenant Commander Robert Lynch sat at a table under a faded U.S. flag and a framed PT boat silhouette. His hair was thin and white now. His hands still bore faint white scars from hot metal and splinters. On the metal shelf behind the bar, next to a row of cheap whiskey bottles, sat a curious relic, a shortened 37mm shell casing, its brass-polished, flattened primer drilled to make it a pencil holder. A younger man, middle-aged with a son back from Afghanistan, asked him about it. "Someone said you put a fighter plane's gun on a little wooden boat," the man said, half skeptical, half awed. Lynch smiled faintly. "We put the nose of a P-39 on PT-48's bow," he said. "Not the whole thing, just the teeth. Weren't you worried it would blow the boat apart?" "Every night out there we were worried about something blowing the boat apart," Lynch replied. "At least this way, we chose how we wanted to roll the dice." He sipped his beer, eyes drifting to the black and white photo on the wall. PT-48 at speed, spray flying, the faint outline of a bare steel snout at her bow. "You know," he said quietly, "back then they called it stupid, dangerous, against the rules. But funny thing about war, yesterday's stupid is tomorrow's standard practice. You give a bunch of scared stubbo, kids a welding torch and a reason, and they'll invent half your next decade of doctrine." Outside, rain tapped on the windows, not unlike the sound of small rounds hitting thin armor. In museums later, PT boats would be displayed with neat plaques listing 37mm bow gun, as if that had always been part of the plan. Aircraft cannon would migrate from fighter hubs to potted gun packs, to helicopter chin turrets, to underbarrel grenade launchers and automatic cannons on patrol boats. The idea was simple and eternal. Take what works somewhere, bolt it onto what you have here, and make the enemy's assumptions obsolete. Back in 1942, on a black night off Cape Esperance, that idea looked like a hacked-off P-39 nose welded to the front of a wooden speedboat, sparks still cooling on the bow. For the men in the Daihatsu barges who first met it, it looked like the mouth of a devil. And for everyone who came after, it was a reminder written in steel and salt water. In war, the line between stupid and brilliant is drawn by the men who are desperate enough to try,